I'm going to read, today we're going to be reading the chapter called Collaborations, and it is on page 187. It looks like we're working in, it doesn't actually tell us the location because I think we're switching back and forth between Marco and Celia right now. This one, we're going to see Marco go in and talk to Mr. Barris about the possibility of working together on a tent, and we're going to see Celia's reaction to that as well. Okay, so here we go with collaborations. Marco arrives at Mr. Barris's London office only a few minutes before his scheduled appointment, surprised to find the normally well-ordered space in near Bedlam, full of half-packed crates and stacks of boxes. The desk is nowhere to be seen, buried beneath the chaos. "Is it that late already?" Mr. Barris asks, when Marco knocks on the open door, unable to step inside due to the lack of available floor. "I should have left the clock out. It's in one of those crates." He waves at a line of large wooden crates along the wall, though if one of them is ticking, it is impossible to tell. "And I meant to clear a path as well," he adds, pushing boxes aside and picking up piles of rolled blueprints. "Sorry to intrude," Marco says. "I wanted to speak with you before you left the city. I would have waited until you were settled again, but I thought it best to discuss the matter in person." Okay, so we can tell by all the boxes and the chaos that Mr. Barris is getting ready to move or close down his London office or something. And Marco says he needs to talk to him before Mr. Barris leaves. "Of course," Mr. Barris says. "I wanted to give you the spare copies of the circus plans. They are around here somewhere." He sifts through the pile of blueprints, checking labels and dates. The office door closes quietly, untouched. "May I ask you a question, Mr. Barris?" Marco inquires. "Certainly," Mr. Barris says, still sorting through rolls of paper. "How much do you know?" Mr. Barris puts down the blueprint in his hand and turns, pushing his spectacles up on the bridge of his nose to better regard Marco's expression. "How much do I know about what?" he asks, after the pause has gone on too long. "How much has Miss Bowen told you?" Marco asks in response. Mr. Barris looks at him curiously for a moment before he speaks. "You're her opponent," he says, a smile spreading across his face when Marco nods. "I never would have guessed." Okay, so at this point in the story, Mr. Barris has just figured out that Marco is Celia's opponent. The fact that he knows that Celia has an opponent goes to show that Mr. Barris does know that there's a game and that Celia is part of the game. "She told you about the competition?" Marco says. "Only in the most basic of terms," Mr. Barris says. "She came to me several years ago and asked what I might say if she were to tell me that everything she does is real. I told her that I would have to take her at her word or think her a liar, and I would never dream such a lovely lady to be a liar. And then she asked what I might design if I did not have such constraints as gravity to concern myself with. That was the beginning of the carousel, but I imagine you knew that already." "I assumed as much," Marco says, "though I was not certain to what degree you were knowingly involved. I am in the position to be quite useful, as I see it. I believe stage magicians employ engineers to make their tricks appear to be something they are not. In this case, I provide the opposite service, helping actual magic appear to be clever construction. Miss Bowen refers to it as grounding, making the unbelievable believable." Okay, so that's kind of like a cool concept if you think about it. Mr. Barris has to actually tone down Celia's magic to make it seem like it's not real. You know, she's so good at it and it's real magic. So Mr. Barris's job is to come in and kind of like tone it down a little bit so that people will not suspect that it's real. So that's kind of interesting. "Did she have anything to do with the stargazer?" Marco asks. "No, the stargazer is purely mechanical," Mr. Barris says. "I can show you the structural plans if I can locate them in this mess. It was inspired by a trip to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago earlier this year. Miss Bowen insisted there was no way to improve it, though I think she may have something to do with keeping it running properly. Then you are a magician in your own right, sir, Marco says. Perhaps we simply do similar things in different ways, Mr. Barris says. I had thought, knowing Miss Bowen had an opponent lurking somewhere, that whomever you might be, you were not in need of any assistance. The paper animals are astonishing, for example. Okay, so as they're talking, Mr. Barris is kind of like trying to figure out what stuff Marco did, like what stuff is magical and what stuff is actually like just a ride, So they're talking about a ride called the Stargazer, and we're going to learn about that later. But the Stargazer basically, it's like you go into a roller coaster cart or something similar, and then it kind of like you're going forward, and then it flips you back so that you're staring upwards, just staring at the sky. That's why it's called the Stargazer. And then we hear Mr. Barris make reference to another tent we haven't learned about yet. One where there are paper animals that Mr. Barris thinks are pretty cool. So we'll hear more about that tent later as well. Thank you, Marco says. I've improvised quite a bit trying to come up with tents that did not require blueprints. Is that why you're here? Mr. Barris asks. For something of the blueprint variety? Primarily, I wanted to be certain about your awareness of the game, Marco says. I could make you forget this entire conversation. Oh, there's no need for such precaution, Mr. Barris says, with a vehement shake of his head. I assure you, I am capable of remaining neutral. I am not fond of taking sides. I will assist either you or Miss Bowen as much or as little as you would each prefer, and I shall reveal nothing to the other that you or she tell me in confidence. I will not say a word to anyone else about the matter. You can trust me. Okay, so Mr. Barris is agreeing to stay neutral on the whole competition thing. He is saying he's happy to